September 1982. Studio One, NBC Burbank. The studio lights had been burning for 3 hours. The air smelled of hairspray and electrical heat, of coffee gone cold in styrofoam cups, and the particular staleness that came from recycled air pushed through ancient ductwork. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, that iconic slab of blonde wood that had become, by 1982, as recognizable to Americans as the Oval Office, and shuffled his monologue cards with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this 4,000 times before. The audience, seated in tiered rows that rose into darkness beyond the camera lights, waited with the trained patience of people who understood they were witnessing a ritual as structured and predictable as a church service. Carson's producer, Fred DeCordova, stood in the wings with his arms crossed, watching the clock. The Tonight Show operated on an internal rhythm so precise that crew members could tell time by which segment was filming. Monologue at 11:35. First guest by 11:42, band segment before the first commercial break, everything choreographed, everything controlled, everything designed to make 75 minutes of live television feel as natural as a conversation between friends who just happened to be talking in front of 15 million people. But this particular taping would deviate from that rhythm in a way that neither DeCordova nor Carson anticipated, and the deviation would reveal something about the man behind the desk that Americans rarely saw, a vulnerability so complete and unexpected that it would later be edited out of the broadcast, preserved only in raw footage that would surface decades later as a reminder that the most powerful man in American television was, in the end, simply human. The Tonight Show in 1982 represented a form of cultural power that has no contemporary equivalent. To appear on Carson's couch was to be anointed. Comedians spoke of it in religious terms. Getting on Johnny meant career salvation. Actors measured their box office viability by whether Carson laughed at their stories. Authors knew that a single 7-minute segment could move more books than a month of print reviews. Politicians understood that Carson's approval, a raised eyebrow, a well-timed laugh, could shift poll numbers. The show was not just entertainment, it was American consensus made visible, a nightly referendum on who mattered and who didn't. Carson himself occupied a peculiar position in the national psyche. He was intimate but unknowable. Americans invited him into their bedrooms every night, the television positioned at the foot of the bed, the volume turned low, his voice the last thing they heard before sleep. Yet he revealed almost nothing of himself. His divorces made headlines, but he never discussed them on air. His drinking was Hollywood legend, but viewers saw only the controlled performer who never slurred, never stumbled, whose timing remained metronomic even after the third vodka in his dressing room. He was the friend who never asked anything of you, who simply showed up at the appointed hour and made the day's chaos feel manageable through the simple act of making jokes about it. The guest that evening was not a celebrity. She was 7 years old. Her name has been lost to the informal archives of unbroadcast material. One of the peculiarities of pre-digital television was that not everything was preserved, not everything was indexed. She had been selected through a segment producer's outreach to children's hospitals in Southern California. The Tonight Show occasionally featured young guests as palate cleansers between the usual rotation of actors promoting films and comedians working out new material. Children were easy television. They said unexpected things. Carson was good with them. Patient, genuinely curious, able to modulate his persona from the knowing cynic of the monologue to something gentler, almost grandfatherly.
The girl had been diagnosed with terminal leukemia. This information was not shared with the audience and would not have been mentioned even if the segment had aired in full. Carson's show did not traffic in pathos. There was no disease of the weak sentimentality, no orchestrated emotional manipulation. If the child appeared healthy enough to sit under studio lights for 8 minutes, then she was simply a guest like any other. The illness was context for the producers, a reason to expedite the booking, but not material for the broadcast. She walked out during the second act, after the first commercial break. Carson stood, as he always did for guests, and extended his hand. She was small, even for 7, The illness had seemed to that, wearing a yellow dress that someone's wardrobe department had selected because yellow read well on camera. Her hair was thin but present. She climbed onto the couch with visible effort, her legs too short to reach the floor when she sat back. The audience offered gentle applause, the kind reserved for children and elderly guests, a sound that communicated encouragement rather than excitement. Carson returned to his desk and began with the standard interview framework he used for young guests. Simple questions. Where do you go to school? What's your favorite subject? Do you have any pets? The rhythm was familiar to anyone who had watched the show. Carson establishing rapport, the child gradually relaxing, the audience warming to the interaction. He was genuinely good at this. His own childhood had been marked by emotional distance, a mother who withheld approval, a Midwestern stoicism that taught him to distrust displays of feeling. But he could access warmth when the camera demanded it. It was one of his many professional skills, honed across decades, as reliable as his golf swing. The girl answered his questions with the careful politeness of a child who had been coached not to say anything embarrassing. Yes, she liked school. Math was hard, but she was getting better. She had a cat named Whiskers. Standard material. Safe. The kind of exchange that would produce a pleasant 3-minute segment, charming enough to justify its airtime, forgettable by morning. Then Carson asked about her favorite thing to do. The girl considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom the question carried weight that Carson could not have intended. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. The studio audience, sensing a shift in tone, grew quieter. Even the band members, who typically used guest segments to rest or tune instruments, looked up. "I like to imagine," she said finally. "Imagine what?" "Being older." The response was unexpected but not alarming. Children often spoke about growing up, about the magical transformation that would occur when they reached some arbitrary milestone, 16, 18, 21. Carson prepared to steer the conversation toward something lighter, but the girl continued. "I imagine what it would be like to be 17, to have a driver's license, to go to prom." She spoke without self-pity, reciting a list she had clearly compiled over many quiet hours. "I imagine getting married, having kids, getting old, like really old, with gray hair." The studio had gone completely silent. This was no longer charming. This was something else. A child articulating her own mortality with a clarity that adults spend lifetimes trying to avoid. Carson's smile remained fixed, but something shifted in his eyes. The producer in the wings moved closer to the stage manager, ready to signal a cut to commercial if necessary. "I know I won't get to do those things," the girl said, still looking at her hands. "But I can imagine them, and when I imagine them, they feel real. For a little bit, they feel real."
Carson did not respond immediately. The pause extended past what television could normally accommodate. 3 seconds, 4, 5. In the control room, the director's hand hovered over the button that would cue the band to play them out to commercial. But Carson had not given the signal. He was simply sitting behind his desk, looking at this 7-year-old girl who had just spoken about her death with more composure than most adults could manage when discussing traffic. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The professional veneer, that carefully calibrated blend of warmth and ironic distance, was gone. "That's very brave," he said quietly. The girl shook her head. "It's not brave if you don't have a choice." And that was when it happened. Johnny Carson, the man who had conducted more than 20,000 interviews, who had sat across from presidents and murderers and comedians having public breakdowns, who had maintained perfect composure through technical disasters and awkward silences and guests who arrived drunk or hostile, began to cry. Not the careful single tear of an actor hitting his mark, but actual, uncontrolled weeping. His shoulders shook. He pulled off his glasses and pressed his palms against his eyes. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or look away. Doc Severinsen, leading the band, stared at his trumpet as if it might offer guidance. The girl watched Carson with curiosity but not alarm. She had presumably seen adults cry before. Family members, nurses, the various people who surrounded terminal children and struggled to maintain professional distance.
She waited patiently for him to compose himself, the way children wait for adults to finish whatever inexplicable thing adults are doing. It took nearly 45 seconds for Carson to regain control. When he lowered his hands, his face was blotchy, his eyes red. He put his glasses back on, but did not look at the camera. "I'm sorry," he said, though it was unclear who he was apologizing to: the girl, the audience, the network, himself. "It's okay to cry," the girl said. "My mom cries a lot." Carson nodded. He picked up a pen from his desk and set it back down, a gesture that served no purpose except to give his hands something to do. "What you said about imagining being older, that's not just brave. That's—" He stopped, unable to complete the sentence. "I have 3 sons," he said instead, "and I don't tell them enough that I love them. I should tell them more." The girl considered this. "You should." The segment ended shortly after. Carson thanked her for coming. She climbed down from the couch with the same effort she had used to get up. He stood and shook her hand again, holding it for a moment longer than protocol required. Then she walked back through the curtain, escorted by a production assistant, and disappeared from his life and from the historical record. Fred de Cordova cut the segment from the broadcast. This was not unusual. The Tonight Show taped more material than it aired, and producers regularly trimmed interviews that ran long or fell flat. But this decision was not about runtime. It was about image management. Johnny Carson did not cry on television. His power derived partly from his control, his ability to navigate any situation with a quip or a knowing look. To show him breaking down would be to crack the carefully maintained illusion that had made him indispensable to American culture.
The decision was probably correct from a professional standpoint. The Tonight Show was not about emotional catharsis. It was about ease, consistency, the reliable pleasure of a nightly routine. Viewers did not tune in to watch their host weep. They tuned in to be gently escorted away from whatever hardness the day had inflicted, to be reminded that the world was fundamentally absurd but manageable, that tomorrow would arrive and Carson would be there again, behind his desk, shuffling his cards. But what was lost in that editorial decision was evidence of something Carson himself struggled with throughout his life: the gap between the man and the performance. Those who worked with him described a person of profound contradictions, generous but remote, kind but withholding, capable of devastating cruelty delivered with a smile, yet also given to unexpected acts of private compassion that he refused to let be publicized. He paid college tuitions for crew members' children and threatened to fire anyone who mentioned it. He donated millions to charity and never attended a single fundraiser. He was, in the assessment of one longtime writer, a decent man who didn't want to be known as decent, because decency implied vulnerability. The girl's statement, "It's not brave if you don't have a choice," had penetrated whatever armor Carson maintained between his private self and his public role. She had articulated something about the performance of living that resonated with a man who had spent 30 years performing ease. Carson's entire career had been an exercise in making difficulty look effortless. The monologue that seemed spontaneous was written, rewritten, timed to the second. The interviews that felt like casual conversations were guided by pre-interview notes, strategic questions designed to elicit specific stories. Even his famous reaction shots, the double take, the slow turn to the camera, were calculated tools refined across thousands of hours of airtime. The girl had no such tools. She could not edit her reality or cut to commercial when it became uncomfortable. She simply existed within the boundaries of her situation and found what grace she could in imagination. And in that unadorned honesty, she had accidentally revealed the machinery behind Carson's performance, the effort required to make life appear manageable, the exhaustion of maintaining control. The symbolic object in Carson's world had always been the desk itself, that blonde wood barrier between host and guest, between performer and audience. He sat behind it for safety as much as for staging. It gave him something to lean on, to hide behind when a joke didn't land or an interview stalled. Comics who were invited to sit on the couch after their stand-up sets spoke of it as a promotion. You had been elevated from performer to person,
granted temporary access to Johnny's world. But the desk remained, always present, always between him and everyone else. When he broke down during that unaired segment, the desk could not protect him. The 7-year-old girl had said something true, and truth had a way of ignoring professional boundaries. There is no record of what happened to the girl after she left the studio. The privacy practices of that era, combined with HIPAA protections that would later formalize what had been informal courtesy, mean that her identity was preserved even as her image was erased from broadcast. She exists now only in the memories of the people who were present that day, the producers, the cameramen, the audience members who signed release forms and went home to tell their families about the strangest thing they'd seen. Carson himself never spoke about the incident publicly. He gave few interviews during his career and fewer after his retirement. When he did speak, it was typically to discuss comedy theory or to offer generic observations about the television industry. He did not reveal himself. Even his autobiography, published posthumously, maintained the careful distance that had characterized his public persona. The people closest to him, his wives, his sons, his producers, described a man who could sit across from anyone and make them feel heard, but who never quite allowed himself to be known. The Tonight Show ended its run in 1992, after 30 years on the air. Carson's final broadcast was watched by 50 million people, a shared cultural moment that would be impossible in the fragmented media landscape that followed. He made jokes about retirement, he thanked his crew, he did not cry. When the cameras turned off for the final time, he walked out of the studio and largely withdrew from public life, granting almost no interviews, making almost no appearances, protecting whatever private self remained after 3 decades of performance. He died in 2005. The obituaries cataloged his achievements, the Emmys, the Kennedy Center honors, the influence on generations of comedians who had studied his timing and stolen his techniques. They mentioned his marriages, his sons, his wealth accumulated through shrewd business dealings that gave him ownership of his show's archives. They noted his privacy, his reserve, his reputation as someone who was beloved by millions but truly known by almost no one. What they could not mention, because so few people knew it existed, was a 3-minute segment filmed in September 1982, in which a 7-year-old girl with terminal leukemia said something about imagination and choice, and Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in American television, the arbiter of celebrity, the voice that 15 million people heard before sleep, wept openly, because for once, just once, someone had said something he could not deflect with a joke or a look to camera. The desk had failed him. The performance had cracked, and in that moment, unaired and mostly forgotten, he was simply a man confronting the same truth everyone eventually faces, that control is largely illusion, that life happens to us despite our best efforts to manage it, and that sometimes a child's honesty is more powerful than a professional's precision. Somewhere in NBC's archives, if it was not recorded over or destroyed in one of the many purges of old material, the raw footage still exists, a reminder that behind every performance is a person, and behind every carefully maintained image is the same vulnerability we all carry, the knowledge that we are making it up as we go, that bravery and choice are not always aligned, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply imagine a future we will not live to see and call that enough. The girl understood that, and for 45 seconds, so did Johnny Carson.